And you want me to select that? Right, well, good evening, everybody. I would first of all like to say that Anna has stepped in at a bit of the last minute, which is utterly lovely and generous of her, and she actually got the most wonderful criticism, in fact, I don't mean criticism, wonderful, whatever the word is, praise, from when she did this lecture in Manchester, and so I'm very grateful, and we're in for a really nice and interesting evening. So I'm going to read this out, because if I don't, I'll miss the most important bits. So Anna's PhD in 2009 was in Exile Studies and focused on the refugees from Nazism who transformed art publishing. The doctorate formed the basis of her book, Emigres, The Transformation of Art Publishing in Britain. Since then, she's published on design and related areas, also co-making a film called Refuge Britain, Stories, Emigre Designers, to be shown at an event at the V&A. The Clothes on Our Back is her third book, and she's now a trustee of Insiders Outsiders and works on events for that festival. As a committee member of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, she's organising a conference on the refugees in trade and industry in 2023. And she's an honorary lecturer in the Centre for Languages, Culture and Communication at Imperial College London, where she taught languages for some 3 decades. So her talk is based on her book, and which is on the screen, and she considers the trade in pre-war Germany, and in particular, the modern approach there compared to Britain. The expulsion of Jews and pathways into Britain follows, and then the wartime production changes. Individual case studies then show the refugees' wide range of experience in this country, but also their contribution to all aspects of the industry, from manufacture to display. So over to you, Anna. And where did Anna talk from, by the way? Oh, you're independent.
I'm independent. Thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. And thank you all for coming, and all the invisible people on Zoom as well. I'd like to start off then. Obviously, this is a talk about the refugees, so we're going to start in the 30s, but I'd like to start much, much earlier in the prehistory, very briefly. And we're going to look at Jews in the Middle Ages in Europe, where they were excluded from many occupations, just one reason being to protect the guilds. Now, this included the selling of new clothes and new fabrics, but they were allowed to sell second-hand goods, lengths of textile and so on, and second-hand clothes, and also even rags, which were quite valuable in those days. Yet rags in Yiddish are called schmatter or schmatter, which gives rise to the name as well. The rag trade, that's a connection. Walking mile after mile, peddling their wares, these Jewish sellers over the centuries got to know where to source material. They got to know who would buy what and for how much. And by the time of their emancipation in the Napoleonic era, they were ready to set up shop, literally, armed with their special knowledge acquired over centuries. All over Austro-Hungarian Empire and what would become Germany, they now traded in fabrics and garments, new and old. Adapting was something that European Jews had always had to do, moving on, moving with the times, trying out new products and techniques, learning new skills, including languages, and very often open to the idea of traveling more than their non-Jewish colleagues because they'd had to. These were all skills and attitudes which they passed on through to their family members and employees. By the end of the 19th century, they had moved up from shopkeeping to the new phenomenon, which was the department store. The first of these were in Paris in the 19th century. big sort of fake Renaissance buildings. But in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, great modernist sleek buildings appeared in cities like Chemnitz in Eastern Germany, like the one here, owned by the Schocken family. Now, the Schockens were Jews who had started as grain merchants in Odessa and had worked their way up in the way I've just touched on. They started with little shops and eventually had a whole chain of wonderful department stores. German department stores at this time, in the interwar period, were fabulous showcases for ready-to-wear fashion, a huge industry in Germany called Konfektion in German. In these buildings, there were not just fashion shows, but fashion teas, fashion films. It was a very exciting phenomenon. It all happened there. In the 1920s, Berlin was the center of this industry. And there's a terrific book on this subject, if you're interested, by a campaigning journalist called Uwe Westphal. And he chronicles not just the huge success of the industry, but also its quick and brutal destruction by the Nazis from 1933. His campaign is to try and get the German fashion industry to recognize what happened. And he's had death threats because of this. And he has now succeeded in at least getting a small plaque up in central Berlin. There were, of course, other important centers of fashion in German-speaking Europe, notably Vienna, Budapest, and Prague, where Jews were major contributors to the clothing trade. Now, they might have been engaged in making uniforms for the Austro-Hungarian army, or local traditional costumes, particularly in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, or just plain fashion, everyday wear, all the activities in the sector. Jews and others targeted started to leave Germany in 1933 when the National Socialists came to power. But most came to this country in 1938 after the annexation, the Anschluss of Austria. The National Socialists' aim was to rid the Reich of its Jewish population and, of course, also its left-wingers, freethinkers, anti-Nazi campaigners, and others. With each piece of legislation that was passed in Germany, like, for example, in 1935, the Nuremberg laws, which set down who was Jewish according to Nazi criteria, there was an increased wave of emigration. Around 90% of the refugees to Britain were Jewish or considered Jewish, and in all, there were around some 80,000 refugees who arrived on our shores before the outbreak of World War II. How welcome were they in Britain? I think the Archbishop of Canterbury today was talking about our illustrious history of receiving refugees. Well, I'm not sure if he was completely right. The government's attitude, I think it's charitable to say, was not disinterested. So they were always keen to take in people who would benefit this country. They were always a priority. But the default setting was really that you couldn't work when you came here unless you happened to bring a company with you or a lot of money. If you didn't, you had to find a guarantor who would put up £50 to make sure that you didn't become a burden on the British taxpayer. So inevitably, some of these 80,000 people were engaged in the textile trade, whether as manufacturers, designers, retailers, display in some capacity. Coming to Britain, for them, meant coming to the place where the Industrial Revolution had started. We were famous. Wool and cotton had been processed here for centuries. Our fabrics were known and admired all over the world. But for some of the refugees, it seemed that Britain had rather rested on its laurels, as we will see. Back in Germany then, some in the trade had grown up in textile families. Here we've got the Ziegler factory in Chemnitz, which was sometimes referred to as the German Manchester. Such was its importance as a textile city. Other people learned the trade at one of the prestigious arts and crafts schools in Germany or Austria, and just as some of the young people from textile families did too, to widen their knowledge and learn some theory along with their shop floor practice. Just one example of these arts and crafts schools was the Reimann-Schule, it was called in Germany, in Berlin, the Reimann School, which was as state-of-the-art in its way as the more famous Bauhaus. But it was much more geared to practical training. Here, you only learnt from practitioners, people who had their own companies, not just textile, it was all sorts of crafts. But if you were studying fashion, you would learn how to design fabrics, how to design clothes, but also how to photograph, how to make films as well. We're talking about the 1920s. A window display was not a subject that you could study in Britain in the 1920s at all. But in Berlin, the shop windows were said to be the best art gallery of the city. So this example of the Reimann School can be taken to illustrate a general point that in Germany, Konfektion was a serious and a very modern career, one which you trained for. Incidentally, the Reimann became a refugee too. The Reimanns were a Jewish family, and in 1936, Albert Reimann was the founder. His son, Heinz Reimann, and his wife fled to Britain. And they did actually manage to set up a much more modest version of the school in Westminster in about 1936-37, bringing with them, crucially, a lot of their lecturers and students. That, as I say, it was a much more modest version. And if you say, well, I've never seen a Reimann school in Westminster, that's because the Luftwaffe flattened it in the Blitz. And we paid the rather dubious compliment by destroying this building that you can see here. It was destroyed by Allied bombing. But you could say the ethos and the experience of the Reimann lived on through these people who came and taught in Britain and then went out to work and were quite an important influence. When the Nazis came to power, Jewish Germans had few choices of where to go. Perhaps you know that America, which had quota systems in place, didn't actually expand their quotas despite this terrible refugee crisis in the 1930s. Palestine was also difficult to enter. In 1938, the Brits introduced for Austrian Jews a visa system. It was actually a domestic visa, which meant that you could come as a housekeeper or gardener, tasks to which many of the Viennese Jews were unsuited, to say the least. It rather reminds me of the Home Office, who said initially when the Ukraine war started that they perhaps could come over as fruit pickers. In Britain, in the 30s, the hungry 30s, of course, there was terrible unemployment, as I'm sure you know. The northeast and the northwest were particularly hard hit, as was a great swathe of Wales. This is where the steel and coal industries had declined. Just one example, Maryport in Cumbria, 1934, unemployment stood at 60%. But there was, you may know of this, I certainly didn't when I started the research, an amazing initiative was made by some very enlightened local MPs and councillors, knowing that in Europe, businessmen were being threatened with Aryanization. So Jewish industrialists whose companies were just bought, they had no choice in the matter, and they were bought for a derisory sum, nothing like the value. Knowing that this was happening to businessmen in Europe, as I said, they created something called the Trading Estates Project in these so-called special areas, the northeast and northwest and Wales. Essentially, they actually just improved the infrastructure, they improved the road system, and they built empty factories. Now, they went over to Europe and invited individual industrialists to come over to Britain, but not to choose the home counties, but instead to move to the northeast, northwest, or to Wales. It was a phenomenal success. Just one statistic, by 1947, they were employing 250,000 local people. A lot of the industries set up were lighter industries, textile, button making, chemicals, things like that. And the people that they employed were, for the large part, initially at least, women. But at least now there was a form of income for all these destitute local families. Some of these companies are still trading today, albeit not in the same sites. Just one is the Kangol story. You may know Kangol berries. Kangol was created by two Polish Jews who had actually been living in France. Many of the refugees who came to this country were similarly double refugees. They'd had to flee the pogroms of Russia or Poland, and then move to Germany, and then had to come to Britain. So this was their second escape. The two Polish Jews were Jacques Spreyregen and his nephew, Joseph Meisner. Now, I found online, and I put it in the book, an interview with a local Cumbrian lady, Mrs. Kath Ford, who went to work for this company, not knowing much about them. She went in 1938. The factory, she said, was owned by a Mr. Spreyregen, not Spreyregen, who was a French Jew, and his nephew, Mr. Meisner, helped him run the firm. We always knew when Mr. Meisner was around because we could smell his aftershave, something which was new in Cumbria. So we were always forewarned of his arrival, and we never got caught out. Continental sophistication in the form of aftershave had reached Cumbria. The French lady referred to was one of two French technicians brought over by Spreyregen, and all the early employees recall the language barrier of the first years. But of course, language barriers are not that unusual in textiles, are they? You have looms, great clacking looms, and people learning to lip read and so on. So I think the local people who joined the firm would have learned by observing. They were shown literally how to make things until they picked up the language, which I'm sure the Spreyregens did eventually. Now, of course, we're talking about these companies being set off 36, 37, 38. They just about got up and running. September 39, Second World War breaks out. Now, for Kangol, this worked out rather well. They had what's called a good war, because in 1942, they got the order from the government to produce headgear for the army. Who can think of Field Marshal Montgomery without his Kangol beret? And they made it not just for the infantry, but also air raid wardens, all sorts of units wore these Kangol berets. A special refugee engineer was brought out of internment to maximize the firm's capacity. So, on the strength of this huge expansion and the commercial success it brought, the firm was ready to continue trading after the war. As I've mentioned before, the refugees' particular strength, I think, was looking to export because they were happy about traveling and learning new languages. By 1952, Kangol berets and other hats were being sold in 49 countries. Kangol constantly changed with the times, bringing in new designers, using the Beatles to model their berets in the 60s. Eventually, production moved over, though, to the USA, where there was a lively market. Think of Samuel L. Jackson, the actor, always wearing his beret in Jackie Brown. But interestingly, the machinery that they use over there is still originally the 80-year-old ones that they first used in Cumbria. They shipped the machinery over. And I interviewed their head of design in New York, and she had a Cumberland accent, which was rather nice. Now, I mentioned internment. This is worth a mention or a comment, because it impacted on the refugees, both their private and their professional lives. In 1940, after the fall of France, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, the British government started to get cold feet about all these enemy aliens, these German-speaking refugees who were in Britain, supposing they were secretly fifth columnists. Perhaps they were preparing to help the Nazi forces invade. So famously, Churchill said, "Collar the lot." And thousands of refugees in Britain were rounded up, many of them shipped to the Isle of Man, where they were held behind barbed wire. Not only were communications minimal, so that their poor families didn't know where they were for some time, but for those who were running companies laboriously just established, it was a bitter blow. Some firms just closed. Others were kept afloat by wives, although in fact thousands of women and some children were interned as well. And others again were saved when the government realized their usefulness to the war effort and released some internees, like the one at the engineer at Kangol. This came about because there was a slight panic when the Isle of Man started to look rather full, and they did worry that they wouldn't be able to accommodate too many more refugees. And the British government started to deport some of the refugees, the internees, to Canada and Australia. And one particular ship, you may know, the Arandora Star, was torpedoed, and very many Italians were held there too as aliens. Italian and German internees were drowned. It was at that point that the British public, I think, started to realize about the refugees. They'd always been rather vague about who they were. Who were these people? Were they Nazis being held on the Isle of Man? But now they read in the press about the Arandora Star. And actually, the memorial is here in Clerkenwell in the Italian church. You see a big ship at the front and a plaque. And the government then passed 3 white papers setting down the criteria according to which internees would be released. But at the top of the list, of course, were people who would be useful to the war effort. They were released first. Now, another of the trading estate success stories was Seckers. This was Miki Seckers, a Hungarian refugee, and his cousin Tommy Gara. The West Cumberland Silk Mills was established in 1938 in Whitehaven in Cumbria, in one of the trading estates. Initially, they were making silks for the couture market, but when war broke out, they quickly changed over to making artificial silk for parachutes. 2 million yards of it, apparently, in all in the war. After the war, Seckers again returned to high-end clothing, selling his fabrics to the likes of Dior and Givenchy. And Seckers commissioned artists to design fabric patterns. Eventually, the firm changed over to furnishing fabrics and relocated. You probably know that in the 1970s, the textile market in Britain all but collapsed in the face of competition from the Far East, where cheaper fabrics were being produced. Many companies went to the wall there, then not just refugee companies, of course, but British companies too. I wondered what these sophisticated Jewish businessmen made of places like the Lake District. Yes, their lives had been saved and their livelihoods assured, but where were the opera houses, the concert halls and the theatres? In fact, it seems that several of the refugees did embrace countryside pursuits and enjoyed the beauty of the countryside. But Miki Seckers, seeing that there was no theatre for miles around, decided to build one on his own grounds, the Rosehill Theatre. It's still there today, and has had a number of celebrated performers there too. Other refugees whose stories are related in my book made a major contribution to British culture too, helping to fund Glyndebourne and the new Edinburgh Festival, very much a refugee operation. They became patrons of institutions. Another example is the Gianogli family, who were the main suppliers of knitwear to Marks and Spencer. They made huge contributions to Nottingham, where they had settled, funding a music library, just one example, and several university buildings. I think there's also a wing of the of Tate Britain is a Gianogli gallery too. Okay, so now I'm going to move away from the trading estates. It's not the only stories by any means, and I shall come to some individual stories which illustrate the wide variety of ways in which the refugees enriched the textile trade, but also some of the challenges that they encountered along the way. Now, the first person, you won't have heard of him, is called Otto Weiss. He was Viennese, and he had worked at the famous Vienna knitwear store Altmann and trained there. Now, a brief word here about alpine knitwear. So in the interwar period, British knitted garments were still fairly traditional. They were heavy and warm. But in the countries around the Alps, so Austria, France, Italy, and Switzerland, they developed this very fine, flexible knitwear, which was perfect for skiing. Those were the days, of course, before Lycra and all these, the materials that we use now for ski wear. And alpine knitwear was a thing, and also it was quite flattering, and people wore it not just on the slopes, but it was they were also fashion garments. So that's alpine knitwear, and that was obviously what Weiss was involved in. But he came to Britain to study at the heart of the wool trade to enlarge his experience. But because he was Jewish, he could never return to Vienna. In 1934, when he came, readers of the Hoyk Express, in the Scottish borders, could have read a small classified ad in which Weiss was offering his services to the British knitwear trade. He was invited to interview by Robert Pringle of Scotland. He was a bit puzzled, though, when he turned up at the small provincial town of Hoyk. There was not even a taxi rank there. From Vienna, Hoyk must have seemed as important a metropolis as Manchester. The interview at Pringle did not go well. When he was asked, Mr. Weiss answered, yes, he certainly could improve on the somewhat shapeless and heavy jumper that he was shown. This resulted in the MD taking offense and saying, we don't need an Austrian here, but they did. And he was persuaded to take Weiss on, a very good move as it turned out, because Weiss had a stellar career at Pringle. During World War II, Weiss exported Pringle knitwear to the Argentine, clocking up £3,000 worth of orders. Once again, it was the refugee who knew how to export and be flexible. But Weiss's big claim to fame was that most British of garments, the twin set. Now, Pringle was not the first to produce. I'll show you a picture of Otto Weiss. There he is in his later years, now a director at Pringle. Pringle was not the first to produce matching jumpers and cardigans. But now, with the finer, this alpine knitwear I've been telling you about, the Austrian-inspired flexible light knitwear, the combination had much more potential. But it was Otto Weiss walking along Hoyk High Street one day who saw baby twins sitting in their pushchair, and he thought of the name Twinset. Now it was a marketable concept, and the Brits loved it. Margot Fontaine modelled it, and other celebrities like the actress Anne Crawford. Certainly my teachers in the 1960s, I think, used to wear a different coloured one every day of the week with their tweed skirts. The princesses Elizabeth and Margaret wore Pringle twin sets, no doubt very much appreciated in the chilly Balmoral Castle. In the House magazine, Pringle's House magazine, you can see photographs of the princesses visiting the works, accompanied by Otto Weiss, now a Pringle director. So that's the first. And now we come to a very different story, double two. Perhaps you'll recognize this as the image from the cover of the book. You have to picture Wakefield Station sometime in 1939. A steam train pulls in, carrying the family of one Isaac Donner, originally from Poland, but who had fled to Vienna to avoid the pogroms of that time. Again, a double refugee, only having to flee the Nazis in 1938. On the Wakefield platform, three figures merged from the steam. One was the manager of the Midland Bank, there was the manager of the Labour Exchange, and a so-called business angel to help the Donners set up their shirt business. A translator soon joined the team too. This was a good welcome because the Donners were bringing employment to a depressed area. Isaac Donner, the father of the family, carried his big idea in his head where it was safe from the Nazis. It was a shirt with extra collars and cuffs, which were easy to join onto an older shirt when necessary. I'm sure you know in those days, the collars and cuffs used to get terribly worn and frayed, and people just didn't have a lot of garments. But no sooner had the Donners set up shop when war broke out. Isaac saw that local girls working in the very dirty munitions factories and others needed clothes which could be washed and dried quickly. Of course, people didn't have tumble dryers and washing machines either in those days. Donner started to produce cheap tops in the new synthetic fabrics, probably rayon, I should think. And they were washed and dried overnight and hugely popular and cheap. Now they could afford to put their double collar scheme into production. By the end of the war, it too was a huge commercial success. In 1951, Donner and a textile trade friend, a Mr. Winfield, came up by accident, as often happens, with a new fabric, the first spun polyester. And proudly, with no irony at all, displayed in the factory is the very first polyester shirt. To cut a long story short, by the 1980s, the Donner groups were employing around 1,500 people and selling over 3 million shirts a year in over 40 countries. The baton was handed from grandfather Isaac to son Richard and then to grandson John, now running the company. Only one of the tributes to them came in the form of a Queen's Award to the for international trade in 2013. The next story, I think, again, you may be familiar with. Who is this? Who's this? Harold Wilson. What is he wearing? Yes, of course. That's right. So Harold Wilson, Prime Minister from 1964 to 70 and again in the 70s, always wore his Gannex overcoat. I nearly wore mine this evening, but it was too hot, and was a friend to its maker, Lord Kagan. Kagan was born in 1915 as, I hope the pronunciation is right, Kaganas in Lithuania, into one of the Jewish textile families I've mentioned. His parents, though, wanted him to achieve more and sent him to the world-famous Leeds University Textile Technology Department, which was really the best place in the world to study at that time. But he returned home during his studies, a fateful mistake, because he was at home when Stalin's forces moved in 1940, and he was trapped there. Forced now to live in the Vilnius ghetto, the family were nevertheless allowed to continue operating their wool mill. Did this perhaps indicate collusion with the KGB? This doubt actually stuck to him for the rest of his life. Worse was to come, as in 1941, Hitler's army marched in and Kaganes was forced into slave labor in a foundry. Ever resourceful, he hatched a plan to hide himself and his family, that's his wife and his two in-laws, behind a small partition backing onto the foundry. They lived in a space just 6 feet long for 9 months. Unbelievable hardship. The Catholic foreman, at huge personal risk to himself, brought them food every day, and his sacrifice was later acknowledged in Israel as a righteous Gentile. When the Russians reoccupied Lithuania at the end of the war, Kaganes moved first to Romania and from there to Palestine. Then he was able to move from there to West Yorkshire, where his father had fled to straight away, right from the beginning. The father, incidentally, lived to be 109 years, so you can see they were a very resilient family. Kaganes' first step was to make rough blankets from a shed near Huddersfield. But in 1951 came his greatest coup. He created Gannex, which had the warming properties of wool and the waterproofing quality of the new synthetics. It was essentially a sort of nylon outer layer bonded to a woolen inner layer, ideal for Yorkshire weather when made into the Gannex raincoat. I like to think of it as a weaving together, trying to make a bit of a heavy-handed metaphor here, a traditional British woolen craft woven together with European know-how. Gannex was an instant hit. Bradford's police force used it for their uniforms. Gannex moved to bigger premises in Elland. Members of the royal family became wearers of Gannex, but its most famous fan was Harold Wilson. He was someone who was committed to reviving the textile industry in Yorkshire. Kaganes, now with his name changed to Kagan, donated funds to the Labour Party and was given a knighthood in 1970. But questions about his Russian connections never went away. Why was he friends with a known KGB agent at the Russian embassy? But eventually, he fell foul of the law in another way. He was alleged to have falsified documents for accounting purposes, and in 1980, he was arrested and stripped of his knighthood and sentenced to 10 months in prison. But always a man to make the best of things, he taught his fellow inmates to play chess to a high standard and gained a reputation as an excellent sewer of mailbags, presumably. Essentially, it was a picnic compared to what he'd been through under the Nazis and under Stalin. On his release, he campaigned for penal reform. Now, not all the people in my book were big names or worked for big companies. So here's just one example, a small example of a modest chap called Walter Berdach, who was born in Vienna in 1904. He wounded in First World War, then he married and had a son, Freddie, born in 1930. So in 1938, the Berdachs, as a Jewish family, had to flee after the annexation of Austria, and he managed to get to Switzerland. Now, as he sat in a synagogue in Zurich with lots of other refugees, he heard an appeal for someone to catalogue books in England. And although he had no experience, he just jumped at the chance, and he managed to get to England, and he got a domestic visa for his wife. All they could bring out with them, apart from their clothes, was a sewing machine and a radio. And unfortunately, many of their goods were stolen en route. This is something which happened to several refugees. Walter arrived in August 1939 and straight away joined the Pioneer Corps. Now, this is one way that you could get out of internment. The Pioneer Corps was the only part of the British forces that refugees were allowed to join. Deep down, the British government still didn't really trust them to fight against the Nazis, even though that's the one thing they desperately wanted to do. The Pioneer Corps was then things like ditch digging, moving heavy machinery. And again, many of the refugees were not really suited to this sort of work, but they joined up anyway. Walter was wounded in France with the Pioneer Corps, and the family was separated for 3 long years, a tough time. But they survived, and by 1946, they were back living in Hampstead and needed to make a living. Now, Mr. Berdach then had a thought. Why didn't British men wear bow ties like Mr. Churchill, or indeed like his fellow Austrians and Germans? He, Mr. Berdach, would put this right, and he would make bow ties. Mrs. Berdach was a skilled seamstress and she had her sewing machine. But of course, there was fabric and clothes rationing. But one day, Berdach noticed some sacks of discarded blackout material, no longer needed now the war was over, and he bought them for a couple of bob. Mrs. Berdach got to work and she made up the bow ties and they put them in little boxes. I've got some of these. Mr. Berdach set off to sell them at the poshest possible shop, starting at the top, the Burlington Arcade. Luckily, there were lots of coming home parties for returning officers and soldiers, and evening dress was in great demand. All of the ties flew off the shelves, and soon Walter got coupons for the ties, proper material now, proper black satin, and they expanded the business called Wabina, with the W-A-B-E after Walter Berdach. Walter was soon selling the bow ties and other neckwear all over Britain. His son, Freddie, joined the firm and took it to another level, exporting all over the world. I went to interview him for the research, and he said he would come and meet me at the underground station in West London. And he said, "You'll know me, I'll be wearing a bow tie." And he was. Now, I'd like to end the case studies with a story that has more of its share of surprise elements. It's Silhouette. Silhouette made underwear, and they were founded in Cologne in the 1870s. Now, there were two Jewish families. There were the Blumenau's, who did the finance, and Lobenberg, who were the technical side. And they kept going through the generations. There were always Lobenbergs and Blumenau's running right to the company right to the end. Early on, Mr. Lobenberg, inspired by a skiing holiday, designed a corset which used boning in the shape of a ski, which slimmed down the heavier women and presumably invoked the idea of healthy alpine sport at the same time. By 1930, already worried by the rise of Nazism, Lobenberg had set up a branch in Paris. But by 1938, the Cologne company had been Aryanized, i.e. pretty much stolen. But by then, they'd already decided to come to Britain, and they set up Corsets Silhouette Limited, where they made rubber corsets which were perforated to stop them peeling or cracking. Slimness was fashionable then as now, and the corsets sold well. But one more story to read you here from the book is the surprise element. Silhouette became responsible for the world's first, and perhaps only, radioactive corset. Oops, I'm going to skip through this lady. In 1937, Hans was approached by his partner Otto from the Paris office and offered the manufacturing rights for a, quote, new and revolutionary, unquote, garment, the radioactive corset Radiant. This foundation garment was advertised with claims that it was made with fabric impregnated with radioactive elements, uranium, thorium, and radium, and was said to give a feeling of energy, fitness, and resistance to chills. Incredible to us now, it was an immediate success, with several department stores making orders. Nothing is known of its long-term effects, if any, on the wearers. I suppose it was a bit like electricity when it was first discovered, that people didn't, they tried it out, giving you shocks for your health, and they tried out all sorts of things. They thought it must be useful for everything. Anyway, that was what they did. And the company chugged along, breaking even, just about, when the war broke out, and Silhouette was ordered to make utility garments. But the Blitz started, and they prepared to move out of London to avoid the Blitz. But before then, though, another slightly unlikely story, not quite as hair-raising, is related, I think perhaps embellished by the family over the years, but nevertheless. They maintained that a stranger walked into the London office and asked for an interview with Hans Blumenau. He said he had created an advertisement for Silhouette in the form of a shapely woman with a gazelle on a lead in silhouette. He asked for no payment should they accept, simply the pleasure of knowing that his design had been appreciated. The advertisement, so the story goes, was duly adopted for their letterhead, packaging, and window display, and the man was never seen again. But, oops, a story of highs and lows. Now came a less glamorous moment for Silhouette when the company and the families then moved to Shrewsbury, where they found a collection of disused buildings, a church hall, an old waterworks, and a pub. The pieces, once cut out to make the undergarments, were wheeled in an old pram across the River Severn to be machined, a very far cry indeed from their smart factory back in Cologne. Both the current Mr. Blumenau and Lobenberg were nearly interned until the authorities realized that they were major employers and were needed. After the war, they managed to start up business as usual again, not realizing that their biggest success story was yet to come. Hans Lobenberg's second wife, the Czech-born Anna-Marie, was a proper trained designer. Having been shown some lightweight material, she designed a girdle with crossover panels which would flatten the heavier stomach, and little X was born. You can see the logo on the right-hand side there. It was an incredible success. In 1957, the firm's annual turnover was £1.3 million. I haven't calculated what that is nowadays, but we all know that's a lot. In the 1960s, as girdle wearing went out of fashion, Silhouette changed over to swimwear, as you can see from this poster, and eventually faded away. The company became part of Shrewsbury's history too, and in 2009, Silhouette the musical was staged there. I've got a copy of the DVD. And that is then the last of the stories that I have to tell you. But as a result of doing the research for all these companies, I started to realize there was a much bigger picture here, and started to think about not just textile and fashion companies, but the refugee companies per se. All the industry and technology and manufacturing and all the different things that they had brought to this country. And yet I'd not seen it celebrated as a concept together. So I persuaded my research centre to hold a conference, and we're having it this coming September. I'm doing a bit of publicity here. So it's called the Refugees from Nazism in Trade Industry and Engineering. And it will be held on the 13th and 14th of September, live in Senate House in London, or you can watch on Zoom as well. Registration opens on the 1st of August. And I'm very pleased that at least 2 members of the Newcomer Society, Deborah Jaffe here and Jonathan Aylan, will be contributing. And I've got 2 very, very full days. I'm just going to give you a sneak preview. It's not spoiler alert, is it? This is just the top of day 1, just to give you an idea. So the first paper is on one of the special areas. It's actually on the refugees who all settled as industrialists in Wales, one of the special areas, by my colleague Andrea Hamill. Rachel Pistol then is going to talk on how it was possible to be released from internment through working in industry. Then my colleague at Imperial, Dr. Star Egger, it's a fascinating paper, this one. It's on patents and inventions Now, this was a folder that the next speaker told me about in the National Archives, in which there are all the letters from internees saying, I've invented this sort of aviation hardware or something for blood plasma. This could be useful for the war effort. And all the correspondence with the ministries either saying, yeah, that's interesting, we could use that, or, oh, we've already got something like that. So very interesting. And she's looking into the how it worked and what were real and genuine and useful patents and which weren't. Then we've got a talk on a technical college, which was set up on the Isle of Man. Then we have one of many, many individual family stories. Professor David is talking about her father, a German Jewish refugee and machine tool engineer. That's just the first few, just to give you a flavor. So I do hope we will see many of your members here. So to finish off then, in the book, there are about, this starts off with context, and then there are 26 stories of individuals who came to Britain and whose lives were saved. But in return, they brought us employment, they joined the war effort, they brought new technology, design, they kept us warm and supported, they brought us color and new style, and I think they more than repaid their debt to this country. Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, I thought that was absolutely mesmerising.
Thank you.
And I would like to say this is Puff, my Icelandic Canadian grandfather. He was professor of medicine at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg.
Oh, yeah.
And he forced them to cancel their Jewish quota.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, I'm very
Wow.
proud of that.
Well, you're the right person to be here.
I know Winnipeg is a bit far away, but
I went to university in Toronto, so I'm interested.
Toronto is sort of nearer. But anyway, who'd like to start? Apart from me, that is.
So it's kind of micro. I'm very intrigued what you said early on that old machinery you this successful program, empty factories being set up and then the textile industry being created. The 80-year-old machines.
Oh, that was in
transferred across the Atlantic when the company moved.
yes, they moved in the, I don't know, quite relatively recently. They moved the original machinery. Actually, there is more about it. There is more about it in the company history. I didn't go into more detail. Of course, I've forgotten the details now, but it is actually covered, the reason that they used it. And
you know, one might equipment, beyond stuff.
Vaguely coming back to me, I have an idea that it didn't go directly like that. In fact, what happened, it was bought and went to China and then was brought back by the Americans. But I have to look, I will look it up for you. Yes.
I mean, that was really, really interesting. Can I ask a bit about the mechanism by which people came from Germany, France, Austria, etc., to this country? I've sort of occasionally looked at sort of refugee scientists who came from Germany in the 1930s, post-33. And William Bragg, who was president of the Royal Society of London from 35 to 40, set up a refugee committee of the society, bringing science, but also other academics to the country and distributors. So Max Born, for example, went to Edinburgh and so on. And that was a really efficient way of rescuing people. And one does have to say in the sciences, particularly, a lot of their English students rescued their professors later on because they got on studying.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there a sort of similar sort of mechanism?
So-
You mentioned engineering there, that seems to be another place where.
I was just going to say on the academics, they had, I've tried to show there were lots of different ways of coming. The academics had something called the Academic Assistance Council, which became the SPSL, Society for Protection of Science and Learning. And their job was to recruit refugee academics and find them work. That was a hugely important function. And they, in fact, employed a lot of engineers, academic engineers in that way. But no, there was no central organization. These were all individuals. I mean, apart from these enterprises like the initiative to attract people to the special areas, which was done through local councillors and MPs going over. But there wasn't any central body, no, for recruiting people. They largely came on their own initiative.
Well, I just add to that, my father's experience worked for big planners in Berlin, but I'm interested in, I didn't know about this, what we call it, the trading estates. Somebody from that family firm, my father was not a member of the family, came in 1935 and found a site in Nyburg in Lancashire, set up a tannery. And once there, quite obvious things from correspondence, they were desperate to try and help the other Jewish people out. But that was the only link.
Yes, and I don't think Lancashire was strictly speaking I don't think that was one of the trading estates, but there were so many stories like this, and Lancashire had a particularly rich in opportunities for industrialists to come. In the Jewish Museum in Manchester, they've got a fantastic, vitrines all about how they attracted industrialists to Lancashire.
But government at the same time pushing through.
I mean, Eric Ash, he's recorded in the British Library. His father's company set up a branch in London, and it was an area developer. And when it was clear which way Germany was going, that company, Eric Ash's father and Eric Ash and his whole family, I think there's really all sorts of ways to do this.
Question from the internet.
Yes.
Chat. Did you look into the men's fashion industry, thinking particularly of Montague Burton, Oscars, famous Jewish?
They were a different generation.
Yeah, they came from earlier.
Much earlier, 19th century. Yes, a very different story. Yes, yes. And actually, yes, Mr. Burton, I presented my book with the chap from the Burton industry at Jewish Book Week once, and we had very different stories to tell. So fascinating in itself. No, there's already a book. There's already a book.
No idea that Burton, Ross and Moss were Jewish.
Oh, well.
I mean, I'm not surprised because of the sort of textile
Yeah.
expertise, but they sound as English as
Yes.
apple pie.
Well, many changed their names, of course. But the Jewish Museum did a whole exhibition on Jewish fashion makers in London, including Mr. Fish. Remember Mr. Fish in the 60s? All sorts of. Yes, there you go. Yes.
I just ask, is there any relation with firms that were area members? How they continue? Because people left their expertise there as well.
That's a very good point. Yes, very often. So back in Germany, the firms that, or Austria, wherever, the companies that were Aryanized were often they were just opportunists, and they just bought them, for nothing. They ran them into the ground. They had no idea. They didn't have the expertise that these Jewish industrialists had built up over generations. So they very often went bankrupt. But of course, some did carry on trading. And then after the war, you had these great battles of restitution and who owns what. And one of the most interesting engineering companies owned by somebody who in Germany was Max Goldschmidt, became Mac Goldsmith. I don't know if you know, Metallastic, they're called. They made metal and rubber bonding and to stop vibration in all sorts of vehicles and aircraft and so on. And the correspondence is in a place called the Keep in Sussex, and it's just file after file after file, all the lawyers and everybody trying to determine, you know, how much of what there is still belongs to everybody. So that's a huge industry as well. And yeah, a lot of people very hard done by and didn't ever make anything like what they should have had back.
Can I ask about, I mean, this is my particular interest, those buildings. I mean, the Schocken building.
Yes.
I mean, it sounds to me, they must have employed the best and greatest, most up-to-date architects. It reminded me of Peter Jones, which actually here is a sort of iconic, you know, Homo building, and that's what I mean, which isn't quite.
That one was designed by Eric Mendelsohn,
Oh,
who was a refugee architect. Yes. And that's interesting. Yes, it came here. Yes. Sorry? It was Chemaev and
my first husband's boss was Felix Samueli, who was, of course, had come over, I think quite early on, was the engineer for that building. And he came over, and of course he knew Mendelssohn and Chemaev. They were all supporting each other as refugees.
Yes. It's a whole fascinating, you know, the refugee architects and the hard time they had here. And there's actually very little modernist architecture. There is somewhere in Clerkenwell by Lebetkin, a Russian émigré, not quite the same, but nevertheless the same generation.
Lebetkin, I was lucky enough to know Lebetkin because he moved to a small flat in Princess Victoria Street in Bristol. And when I turned up with Frank Newby, who was the hottest structural engineer of his generation, I mean, we used to have Lebetkin, you know, who was wonderful. But I hadn't seen, you know, naturally, I knew who, I mean, it's only now I'm seeing it in context.
These lovely, like the Schocken department store, they were absolutely beautiful. They were all destroyed. They were taken over by the Nazis and used for storage, and then they got bombed, basically. I don't think that was a reconstruction that you saw there. I don't think there are any of them left.
It was wonderful.
Yes.
And the top window lights were.
Yes.
Either for display in some shape.
There's a fantastic book about the Riemann School, this thick, in German. It's not in English, but it was a real phenomenon. It was absolutely, and again, not very well known in this country. There's a very small archive at the University of Brighton, mostly on the British reincarnation of the Riemann School. But yeah, it's a very interesting topic.
And I think we should, because being a musician, we must remember that the Amadeus Quartet came out of the Isle of Man.
3 of them did. Yes, they did. Yes. 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 There's a lovely exhibition on at the Royal College of Music, the refugees and music, everything, Kleinborn, the Amadeus Quartet, Hoffnung. Recommend it. It's a lovely exhibition.
I mean, it seems to be totally extraordinary that we benefited colossally from all of this, and at the same time, the government has been so sort of niche and really minded.
Yes, yes, that's right. Yes. The refugees were incredibly grateful, nevertheless, you know. I've interviewed people who were interned, and they said, oh, well, you know, at the time, and they weren't bitter. I mean, some of them had a terrible time in terms of suicides, you know. They didn't know they weren't going to be invaded. They thought they might be sitting ducks when the Germans invaded. But nevertheless, you know, a lot of them were pretty sanguine about it and said, well, it was the panic of the time, and they didn't hold a grudge against the British government.
I think there was that marvelous quote, because there was another famous internment camp outside Manchester at whatever it's called.
Outside Liverpool, Huyton, outside Liverpool,
and
yes.
It was said that, you know, and of course that it was all very basic, and it was said that you saw the greatest brains in Europe. Staggering.
They set up universities in the camp.
But staggering across, you know, pouring rain, wet fields, you know, absolute sort of basic with a towel wrapped around their waist, the outside privies, you know, the greatest brains in Europe. there's much.
Pevsner was in that
Pevsner was
camp.
there,
Yes, he
yes.
was in Heiden
And
camp.
it's possible, that's why I got, but I can't
Mm.
remember, but there was a quote and I'm paraphrasing it
Yes.
badly. No, I mean, it's
Yes.
the most extraordinary story. And I was brought up in Hampstead
Ah,
and you walked from the top of Hampstead High Street to the bottom and you heard every language. If you walk from the top of Thurlow Road to the bottom of Downton Hill on Thursday afternoons, you hear people playing string quartets. I mean, it
yes.
was-
Apparently the tram conductor used to shout out, Finchley Strasse. Yes. Oh, well, you were in the thick of it.
I mean, I could clang on forever, but I'm not, because we're going to take you out to dinner, so I need to get Deborah to devote that. You can clang on for a few minutes and then peak.
Oh, Deborah's an expert.
That's fantastic. I learned something as well about my aunt who went to art school in Leipzig in
Oh.
the early 30s.
Yes.
And came here probably about 35 and worked as a window dresser at
Oh,
Marks and Spencer's in Kilburn.
oh, right.
And you mentioned the window dressers.
Yes,
and
yes.
The Leipzig art school.
Yes.
To Kilburn.
The best shop windows in London were Simpsons of Piccadilly, and that was Natasha Kroll, who'd been at the Ryman, both in Berlin and came to the
Thank
London
you
one.
very, very much. And we will meet again at the conference. And I hope
Wonderful.
members will come because it's very ranging and continue the work because this is
Just the beginning, isn't it? It's just
Yeah.
the beginning.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple of books left if anybody would like a book.
Right, can I suggest that Dan, who in fact runs our communications system, when you've got a flyer for that conference ready to go, we'll send it to me if you like.
That is the flyer. I have that PDF. I will send it to you, yes.
Because actually, I think that we should circulate it to the society.
That would be
really,
lovely.
really do. So
That would
can
be
you- can you-
fantastic.
can you do
Yes,
that in-
yes, I will. I'll just send it to,
Separate
I'll send it to
sections.
Sarah
Send it
Jane.
to Sarah Jane.
Yes, that would be lovely.
I
That would